Thank you for the invitation to come and speak to Pitt Street Uniting Church about covenanting. I met Margaret about a year ago when we were both on a walking on country tour. And then there was another one earlier this year, which I will talk a little bit about as I reflect on the readings. The reading from Psalm 107, for me, carries some insight into what life is like and has been like and continues to be like for the first peoples of this nation. Because as most of you are probably aware, there were hundreds of nations before the invasion by Europeans. And people of those nations have been scattered. Scattered not just physically but emotionally as well. What does it mean then for them? The words of hope in this, which I think they're still waiting for, to be brought home from foreign lands. I've been reading a little bit of Henry Nouwen's writings over the last few months as part of my daily reflection, and a reading that I just read a few days ago, just a short couple of sentences from what he has to say on Christian action, I thought was really relevant to what I want to say to you today, reflecting on these readings and thinking about our relationships with Indigenous Australians. He writes this: all Christian action, whether it is visiting the sick, feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, or working for a more just and peaceful society, is a manifestation of the human solidarity revealed to us in the house of God. He goes on to write that Christian action is not a nervous effort to bring divided people together, but a celebration of an already established unity. It's a vision, I think, of what covenanting is about. It's entering into that reality which seems to be hidden from us, that there is in fact an existing unity among all peoples, of all tribes, of all nations, of all cultures, of all languages, of all sexual orientation, of all the things that we tend to allow to separate us. More formally, covenanting within the Uniting Church was an agreement initially said at the 1993 Assembly of the Uniting Church, when our then President Jill Tabat read out a covenanting statement, and that was responded to by the then President of the Uniting Aboriginal Islander Christian Congress as National Committee, Pastor Bill Hollingsworth. My role over the last 2 years or so, or nearly 3 years now I think it is, honorary position of covenanting convener for the Synod. And I'm still trying to work out what that means. The 3 years has been a frustrating experience for me, to be honest. The frustration is the lack of response that I've received from presbyteries throughout the Synod, with only a few exceptions. Just to give you an example, I see my role as what I thought my role was going to be was to inform and resource people by getting congregations who are already in a covenantal relationship through their presbyteries to communicate through me to other presbyteries, so at the end of last year, I was getting nowhere working through presbytery, so I decided to send a survey out through the presbyteries to every congregation. 3 presbyteries I got no response from at all. Well, they'd said they were sending the survey out to their congregations, but I received no responses. One of them was the Sydney Presbytery. The other one was my presbytery, the Sydney Central Coast Presbytery. And the other one was the one where I spent most of my time in ministry, Canberra Region Presbytery. I'm naming and shaming now, folks, because I'm so annoyed, to be honest. So little response. And then when I was on the last walking on country tour, we heard from people from there were a number of people there from the Queensland Synod, and I discovered they have 2 paid people serving together in an equivalent full-time position of covenant conveners. And they've set up a reconciliation action plan. And we've done, I won't say it, very little in this synod. Why is it important? Well, I'll tell you a little bit of what I experienced on the most recent working on country tour, and I noticed we've got at least 3 people here, Beth and, mine's gone blank, from Katie and Isabel. Was there anyone else here who was on that walking country tour? So I'm going to remind you of some of the things we experienced. Anyway, I invite you to take out your $50 notes if you've got them there and have a look at it, because you can see in the background a $50 note there. The reason is that David Unipon is featured on the $50 note, and also not only David Unipon, who was a great activist and leader of the Aboriginal people and was also an inventor. Very brilliant man, and his church, which still stands there today in the town of Rawkin, which we visited, that's a photo that I took of the Rawkin Congress Church, Aboriginal church, and that's also on the $50 note. This township is the centre of the Gurindjeri Nations. It was set up as a church mission in the 19th century by a pastor who took the trouble to learn their language and encourage cultural practice. But as happened in a lot of the missions, in 1916, the government decided that they would take over, they'd do a better job than the churches. And so that's what happened, and the people then experienced very harsh treatment. If I'd show you, I'm only going to show you 3 photos, but this is, I don't know how clearly you can see it, but if you look at the expression on the faces of these residents of Rawkin Mission, taken in 1939, and I don't think you can see anyone smiling, because that's what life was like for them then. They had to stay there. If they wanted to leave, they had to get permission from the superintendent of the mission, who of course was a white man. And if they wanted a visitor to come, they had to get permission from the white man. If they wanted to marry, they had to get permission from the white man. They were treated like animals. And you can see it in their faces. It's no wonder that so many Aboriginal people at that time, after 1916, chose to live in makeshift accommodation. One of my experiences as a very young man, an 18-year-old, Bruce, I wasn't going to mention this, but I think I will. In 1965, I was on the Freedom Ride led by Charlie Perkins, and one of the strongest memories I still have with me was going into the town of Wellington and then going to where the Aboriginal people were living on the outskirts of the town, because they weren't allowed to come into the town unless they were prepared to live in the mission station at Namina. So most of them lived out of the town, and it was my visit to Rawkin that I first understood the reason why they chose not to live on the missions. It hadn't really sunk into me until I saw those pictures and heard the stories of the people at Rawkin. In that town of Wellington in 1965, we visited where the Aboriginal people were living in this, I guess you'd call it a makeshift camp shift. The buildings were corrugated iron with sackcloth for doors and windows, and it was next to a garbage tip. As an 18-year-old, I'd never experienced anything like that in my life, and it shocked me. And that shock stays with me. The township of Rawkin is just so different to that. They obviously have pride in their township. The buildings are good. They've got strong leadership. We met a couple of men in their 20s or early 30s who were up and coming leaders of the Gurindjeri people, and they have hope for the future, not bitterness about the past. We heard their stories. One person that I met there, a chap called Russell Rigney. He's aged 71. He's not one of the ones there, but his ancestors, his father is in one of the, not this particular photo, because there's about 10 photos like that of people all taken in 1939, the different families. A lot of Rigneys were there. He returned only 3 years ago. He came back after being away for most of his life because he was part of the stolen generation. And so I think Russell could relate a little bit to what it was saying in the psalm we heard. He was able to give thanks for the steadfast love of God because he'd come back home, albeit age 68, but he'd come back home. What we heard from the people at Rawkin was their desire to have relationship with us, with the white people. They also spoke about this idea: voice, treaty and truth. And they confronted us with the idea, well, what does the reality of our lives as the people have been oppressed since invasion in 1788, who are amongst the most impoverished people in earth, who lived a rich life before January 1788, and it's been taken away from them. They've lost their land. They're trying to recover their culture. What does it mean when we have our laws imposed on what ownership of land means? And one of the men that spoke to us, one of these upcoming leaders, spoke about restitution. It's not a word we hear much, but it gets to the heart of the reality of relationships between the dominant culture and the ones from whom the land was taken. It gets to the heart of the question about what human solidarity is revealed to us in the house of God, and what does it mean for the way we live. I'm going to just talk briefly about a couple of other places we went to. We went to Wellington, that same town that I visited, trying to work out, 53 years ago, I think it was. 54 years ago. And we met Tom Sloan, who's the pastor at the Congress congregation there. And he described what it is for his people there. Small congregation in a building that I think used to be a Methodist church way back. And what he does there mainly, apart from leading worship of a Sunday morning there in another country town not too far away, most of his work is involved in ministry to men through a men's shed, visiting people in hospital, conducting funerals, providing a safe space where men who have been released from prison, who have problems with mental health, problems with addictions, can come and find safety and find hope, and some of them find a way forward in their lives. He gets help from the Condobolin congregation, who have quite a good music ministry. It's fantastic to worship there if you like country and western music. They remind me of the Sapphires. I don't know if you saw the movie, the way they sing their songs, and they come out. And in the walking on country we went to last year, we visited Condobolin Church, and what I've discovered since about the Condobolin Church through the Regional Committee of Congress here in New South Wales is that the building's in danger of falling down. It's become almost dangerous to walk in it, because the floorboards are sort of giving way in places. And our regional committee has some money set aside for the repair of it. The building that they're worshipping in a few years ago was used to be the Uniting Church there, but the Uniting Church congregation closed through lack of numbers, and the Macquarie Darling Presbytery decided to give it to Congress. And there had been a Aboriginal Evangelical Fellowship worshipping somewhere there in Condo, and they became part of Congress. But the question in my mind is, we worship, we the non-Indigenous people worship in buildings like this. Some of them are fortunate and can worship in that fantastic building in Rauchan. But most are struggling. In fact, on this last walking on country, when we were in Alice Springs, we met Pastor Julia Lennon, who's the pastor of the Congress. They're not a congregation yet, they're a fellowship, a faith community. That's the terminology we use. They're a faith community at Oodnadatta. She drove 2 hours on a dirt road from Oodnadatta to Alice Springs just to come and talk to us. And they worship Sunday mornings in the open, in the middle of winter when it's freezing cold, in the middle of summer when it's burning hot. They haven't got a building to worship in. The Indigenous people want a relationship with us. That's what covenant is about. It's a relationship that, according to what Henry Nouwen wrote, already exists, but we have to start living with them as if it, in the light of the reality that that relationship already exists, rather than denying it. This is the truth of what covenanting's about. But it's also, I think restitution's an also important part of this covenanting process, because we've got it all together, folks. And there are people in our uniting church who do not. Not for lack of faith, but because of their circumstances that are imposed by the invaders and we benefit from today. This is the heart of what covenanting's about. And there are ways forward. The Synod of South Australia has set up a special fund to raise money to put up a building at Oodnadatta for the church. And I'm sure our regional committee would be very happy to receive donations to help with the repair work necessarily at Condobolin. But there are Aboriginal people living close by here that we could form a relationship with. And that's really the more important thing that I've heard from Aboriginal people. That what they really want is a genuine relationship where we listen to the stories, we acknowledge the truth, and we learn from one another. We form friendships and learn from one another. And if you haven't picked up from what I've been saying on a connection with the Luke reading, and think about it. Think about what we have, what we put aside for the future when there are people in desperate need today. Are we storing up treasures for ourselves? If so, for what purpose? What I've found meeting with Indigenous people is that there is great joy in forming those relationships, getting to know one another, hearing one another's stories and learning from each other. And then human solidarity becomes more real through the grace of God. Amen.